U.S. oil storage tanks are on track to run dry by July 4th. Here's what that actually means. A senior advisor at the Carlyle Group said it on Bloomberg last week, so I wanted to make this video and go over what that actually means for you. But before I get into this, give me a follow if you want regular updates on this catastrophic war and the economic fallout. I'm a veteran and I have a master's degree in supply chain management. So I've studied logistics and how the bullwhip effect, which is the idea that disruptions take time to ripple through a system than the initial shock suggests. And this looks like a textbook example of the bullwhip effect. First, let's talk about what tank bottom actually means. Because when most people hear that oil storage tanks are getting low, they think, okay, the tanks themselves are almost empty, but that's not exactly what this means. You see, oil storage tanks require a minimum volume of liquid for the pumps to actually function. When levels drop below a minimum threshold, the remaining oil becomes physically inaccessible. The pumps fail, the oil can't move, and the pipeline stops functioning. So you haven't literally run out of oil, but you run out of the ability to access the oil you do have. And the last 15 to 20% of that oil can't be accessed at all due to the floating roofs that they put on top of the tanks to prevent evaporation. When those get too low, you risk collapse, and which creates fire and explosion risks. So when Jeff Currie, the senior advisor at the Carlyle Group, goes on Bloomberg and says that he's never seen anything like this before in history, and that tanks will hit bottoms in Europe this month and in the United States around July 4th, he's not just saying that supplies are running low, but rather that the system is reaching the point where it no longer functions if we can keep depleting the stores that we have. So let's talk about timeline, because it's happening right now, even if you have not fully felt the effects of it. JP Morgan predicted that OECD countries, as in the US, Japan, Korea, Europe, will hit operational minimums sometime between May 9th and May 30th. Today is May 11th, so we are squarely in that window. And according to JP Morgan, that's the point at which prices become exponential. Asia is already there, as in Pakistan, Indonesia, the Philippines, they're already reaching tank bottom, specifically for gasoline. India is already hitting LPG shortages because 60% of their cooking gas comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Airlines across Asia are already canceling flights, and South Korea has imposed mandatory export caps on refined petroleum. Europe hits it this month. Goldman Sachs published a study that predicted that Europe's jet fuel inventories will fall below the IEA's critical 23-day threshold sometime in June. The EU Energy Commissioner has already shifted his language from a potential pricing issue to a supply disruption, with the UK being the greatest risk of having to ration jet fuel, according to Goldman Sachs. For the US, it supposedly hits around July 4th. US gasoline inventories fell for the 11th consecutive week just this past weekend. And gas prices are up 70% compared to this time last year. The national average for gas prices in America is $4.48, which is 50% higher than it was before the war started. And in places like LA or San Diego, where I live, it's already well above $6, some places $7 a gallon. Diesel is 16 cents away from an all-time high. And retail gas surged 30% just in the last week alone, which is the fastest increase since before the war. Now, the reason that your gas prices went up has almost nothing to do with U.S. oil supplies directly. What happened was Europe ran short on jet fuel, so their refineries shifted over towards their capacity, making more jet fuel and diesel, which decreased the amount of gasoline that they produced. So because there was a gasoline shortage in Europe, that raised your prices here in the US. So a fuel shortage in Europe is showing up in your gas bill. And that's just how interconnected these global energy markets really are. The New York Federal Reserve published a study this last week that said low-income houses are cutting their gas usage by 7%, and high-income houses are decreasing their usage by 1%, which essentially shows that the people who are least able to absorb this impact are absorbing the brunt of it. Spirit Airlines shut down after government bailout talks failed. And more airlines are at risk if oil remains above $150 a barrel. And if more airlines go under or airlines start cutting flights, that increases the price of the remaining flights, assuming demand stays the same. So this is just inflation across the entire market. Now, the most important thing to understand about this is timing, because even if the Strait opened up tomorrow, it wouldn't fix things quickly. Jeff Curry, the Carlyle Group analyst, even said if this standoff was resolved today, it would still take 3+ months before supply levels began flowing back to normal levels. Shell's CEO said that you can't just simply turn the system back on. You factor in the infrastructure damage done to the refineries in the Gulf, as well as the time it will take to clear the Strait of mines. All of those add months to get us anywhere close to where we were before this war started. This is what the bullwhip effect looks like in real time. Remember, the Strait closed 10 weeks ago, back in February. The full consequences of that action are still working themselves through the system. And what you're feeling today at the gas pump or in airline prices or food prices is not the end of it. We're actually just in the middle of it. And the downstream effects on food prices and manufacturing and shipping rates haven't even worked their way into the equation yet. But don't worry, they're coming. And this is what happens when you start a war in one of the world's most critical energy corridors with no plan for what happens once there are supply chain disruptions. The IEA called this the biggest energy security threat in history. These aren't fringe analysts or doomsday panicans. These are the institutions that run the global financial system, telling you that something unprecedented is happening.